Okay, close connection between the previous topic and this one. Yeah, so groups are closely related to authorities, because groups tend to form around some sort of authority. You know, whether that's the authority of a leader or the authority of a text or a tradition or something of that kind. And obviously, groups are a pretty basic part of our experience because we're social animals and so on. Yeah, that we can't really avoid groups. So we need to work with that aspect of our experience. And perhaps just to define what I mean by a group to start with, because it's a rather a big concept in some ways. So I'd say any association of people with shared goals from 2 upwards. So that's quite a big big definition, yeah. So it could be a group of 2, could be a couple and making a group, could be the United Nations, you know, it's a group of us all. So there's huge range of potential things that we might mean by a group. All we've got in common is associations of people and shared goals held by that group. So groups, for example, can be formal and informal. So you can have a bunch of friends who goes down the pub, and that's an informal group. You could have a more formal group which is constituted in some way, such as a club or society or a party or whatever. Obviously, they can vary in size, but there's a lot of complexity involved here. So most people are involved in multiple groups, and perhaps that's particularly the case with modern society. I think that the kind of groups that people are involved in has multiplied, particularly through the internet, which has allowed people who are geographically scattered to form new sorts of groups across boundaries, and that's how the middle way has become possible. Middle way society has become possible because of the internet, really. So, you know, you might, for example, be a middle-aged Sikh Labour voting teacher living in Birmingham. You know, that's 5 groups to start off with before you start on the more informal ones and their family and so on. So those groups may also be vaguely defined. So the boundaries of groups are often unclear. So if it's something like party membership, then there's a definition to that. But even something like a political party also has hangers-on who are in some senses part of the group and in other senses not part of the group. So that's again something you have to take into account when talking about groups. But regardless of all these different factors that make groups multifaceted and vague and so on, there are, I think, some consistent factors in the way they work or the way we can practice with them. And that's just the recognition that they can be a source of dogmatic authority and conformity. So, you know, the group itself can have authority over us just as an individual or a text or whatever can do. Or, at the same time, the group may reflect or reinforce an authority source of some kind, because the rest of the group is following it in the same way. So peer pressure is obviously a thing there. But the same kind of balance is involved here. So are we giving the group sort of an absolute authority of as a group, or do we give it provisional authority as a group? So I'm not suggesting that groups are bad, full stop, just that where the identification with a group becomes absolute, becomes metaphysical, then there's an imposition, there's use of power and so on in the same way as with authorities. But there are nevertheless provisional ways of working with groups. Now, if we think about this more in relation to experience, I mean, personally I've had a sort of long-standing issue with groups. I tend to react to groups, let's say. I think I've done so since childhood, and so to perhaps engage with them in a provisional way for a while and then felt them to be absolute in some sense, and then perhaps left them. So that's certainly been my relationship to religious groups, like such as Christian ones and Buddhist ones. But I guess even at the same time, there have been other groups that I've continued to be member of or associated with that have maintained a certain amount of, well, social integration in my life, and I guess that's the case for most other people. So there were a set of cognitive biases associated with groups, which again show some of the ways in which groups may have absolute authority in some circumstances and sort of skew our judgments. So there's the in-group bias to start with, and that's the tendency to judge people inside your group by different standards to people outside it. So you have higher expectations. For example, if you're interviewing people for a job, for example, and you're interviewing someone from outside the group you identify with, then you might expect them to jump through more hoops than somebody who's inside the group. So actually, one example that springs to mind is the interesting scene in the Iron Lady film about Margaret Thatcher, about when she was interviewed for her constituency to stand in a constituency as a Conservative candidate by a committee of, I think it was rather elderly sort of establishment men who put her through it, were pretty doubtful about the fact, could a woman stand as a Conservative candidate in this constituency? So she had to work harder and do better in order to get that place.
Is racism based on this bias?
Certainly, yeah, it can be. It overlaps with a lot of other biases, but yeah, racism can be an indication of it. So if we tend to judge people outside our racial group more harshly, or we set different standards, then that'd be an indication of it.
That example with Margaret Thatcher, though, that's something that's fed back almost universally, particularly anything you see written about women in positions of power and the still imbalance of power, particularly at the top. You always feel like you have to work twice as hard and prove yourself twice as much as a woman to get into the same bracket as men.
But obviously it's not just a question of male groups, but there may have been class elements in this as well, because she was middle class and the establishment people she was lower middle class particularly, and the establishment people were upper middle class or upper class. Yeah, so there may be a number of other factors involved complicating the gender thing there, but that might be part of it. Another example is what's become known as groupthink, where people in a group make poor decisions really because they're afraid to challenge the group consensus. So they may well have thoughts about alternatives to what is current in the group, but perhaps because of fear of not being accepted by the group, of peer pressure in effect, they don't raise those issues. So therefore, the group ends up making a terrible decision. I think there's some famous examples of that with Enron in the US and the decisions they made before they folded or collapsed.
A very local one with the board of Northern Hills Conservators over St Anne's Royal Cafe. That was a small cabal who wanted to get the tenant out, and against the regulations they're governed by, the Morgan Hills Act, and that they, were found to deliberately withheld information from the rest of the board to guide them in the direction to make the decision they wanted to. And of course the other board members were assuming that their people guiding them would be telling them the right thing and being open and transparent, and they knew better, and so followed along, and then there was this completely unjustified attempt to get rid of the tenant. Eventually, it was a campaign that saved him, but that's when the inquiry sort of discovered all the kind of stuff that had gone on behind that. But there was a huge amount we'd identified in the process. It was very difficult to challenge when things were coming out, because not many of the board were willing to engage with anyone from the outside to get new information because they just had this absolute trust that...
Yeah. I mean, another possible term for that is false consensus. So that a consensus is established, but actually that consensus perhaps doesn't exist internally for the people involved. It's just what they've agreed to externally. So again, that brings out the need for psychological integration as well as just social consent, as it were. And then social proof is another example of cognitive bias of this kind, where basically your basis of judgment about what's right or wrong, or good, correct or incorrect, depends only on the group without reference to any further criteria or judgment. So obviously you can see this particularly at points where some kind of challenger to a widespread consensus, might be scientific or political or religious or whatever, stands forward and gets a great deal of opposition from people who don't really examine what they say, but just what the accepted position is. So it could be Martin Luther, or could be Galileo, or those sorts of examples spring to mind. So how do we respond to, or can we respond to this kind of tendency in ourselves to accept the authority of groups unquestioningly? Well, obviously, there's an extreme response, which is individualism, what can be labelled individualism. I think which is something I've been prone to myself at times, and that's to believe or assume that you can just get by without the group, that you can make your own judgments uninfluenced by the group. I think in most cases, or in many cases at least, that can be very deluded, in the sense that even the resources we're using to be individualistic have probably come from some other group or some other association with other people. And then individualists tend to form new groups of individualists as well. And in some ways, I think, again, the internet has made that easier. So you can form an extreme group, for example, even though there are only few of you scattered around the place.
Set up a Facebook page.
Indeed, set up a Facebook page. Yeah.
Off you go.
Yep. So you can defy the United States government and hold yourself up with your supplies, waiting for the apocalypse or whatever, and you're different, and you're an individual, and you're really thinking it over. So you could turn into a counter group. So obviously that's not the solution. Is that the middle way involves making provisional judgments about groups. But that's not the only kind of way in which we encounter groups and need to find that middle way. So it suggests there's there's a couple of other aspects to the way we encounter groups or find groups which are to be looked at. One of these is tradition. So tradition is groups over time, so I understand it. Yeah. So groups have certain kinds of identifying symbols, things they, goals they share and symbols they use, which are maintained over time, and then they turn into traditions. So the group can become authoritative in that way by dogmatically accepting what tradition has passed down to them without further question. Now again, that can tradition can be useful. You can see it as kind of an economical way of preserving the benefits of past investigation. So it can again be rigidified, or it can be provisional in the way we treat it. And we look particularly at Nassim Nicholas Taleb, his book Anti-Fragile, which I think is very interesting. He talks a lot about the ways in which traditions kind of organically preserve rather complex resolutions of things, that we might think that we can resolve things just by coming up with a new plan which deals with all the eventualities, but usually we miss a lot when we do that through grand plans. So traditions having built up more gradually and through lots and lots of different complex interactions between people, between groups, preserve the fruits of past wisdom, as it were. So he gives the example of traders. I think it's in Beirut, because this is where he comes from originally, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. But there was this sort of brash new graduate in economics who went to sort of traditional traders in the bazaar and said, "Well, the way you trade and the way you negotiate is just terribly inefficient. We should do it in this completely new, different way." But he was just laughed at by the traders who had established this sort of complex, multifaceted way of relating to each other and of trading that took all sorts of things into account that this newcomer just wasn't thinking about. So tradition can be helpful in that kind of way. At the same time, it can be sort of juggernaut that drowns opposition from any kind of new thought. It can be associated with metaphysical beliefs of one sort or another, and pass them on, underline their authority. And it often does that also through rituals, which is another aspect of the way that groups operate, in that they tend to do certain things which become symbolic of the group and how the group works. And so obviously religious ritual is a very formalised version of that, the Catholic Mass or the church service or something like that. But if you've got you might have a small group of friends that have developed rituals in the same way, so you go down to the pub and have a round of drinks and whatever, so you do certain things at certain times which become emblematic of that group and how it operates. And if you disturb them, then that might disturb the group or be seen as disruptive to the group or encounter resistance. Now, I've been very struck by, at least in my experience, by the ways in which ritual can be based on dogmatic authority, really. So certainly in my experience of Buddhism, the ways in which rituals were laid down by tradition was something I often found oppressive, that it seemed to prevent people engaging with the ritual, at least potentially. So while some people might be quite happy in their acceptance of a particular ritual, those who, like me, weren't particularly, might still feel, I've got to go along with this because otherwise the group might not accept me. So it became the price of group membership. And if it's the price of group membership, then, if you think about what I said earlier about power, you're afraid of the consequences. Power is being wielded, in effect, by the group there, if you're afraid of the results of challenging it in some way. So that, as well as being consciously dealt with through discussion of policies and so on, it can be much more unconsciously or habitually done through rituals in the group. The rituals reinforce that authority of the group over the individual.
So when you were in that sort of situation, was there repression or suppression going on with you there?
To some extent there was repression, I think, yeah. As long as I stuck it out, thinking, well, I have to do this because of my desire to be part of the group. So, yeah, that certainly has repressive aspects. Obviously, there are limits to how far I actually went down that path, but it was repressive.
So what, would that be something like, for example, bowing, which obviously it's very visible, whether you're participating in that or not, but nobody can tell what your internal thoughts are or feelings about it and how much you're doing it because you believe in it, or but not to do it because bowing is in many ways a sign of respect. So it could easily be misinterpreted that if you chose not to do it because it didn't have meaning for you, that you were in fact being disrespectful. So in fact other people's reasons perhaps judging you might not have been actually appropriate if there'd been an opportunity to have a dialogue about why you might be choosing not to bow.
Yeah. I mean, that's so I don't know if it's a real issue, but it's a potential issue in our meditation group, isn't it? So everybody else bows and I'm the one who doesn't bow. But I mean, the reason I don't bow is it's not just beginningness, but also I mainly interpret bowing as a sign of submission. So sort of submission to what? I mean, that's very much where it seems to have come from in terms of the social origins of the ritual of bowing. You're showing not just respect, but something a bit more than respect.
It's interesting that in these situations I don't personally bow, but I don't have a problem with people doing it as a meaningful experience rather than a belief, but it's knowing that in a sense in that group. But then putting your hands together without bowing is, to me, doesn't have that idea of subservience either, that submission. It's just an acknowledgement to the tradition or to those teachings, which...
but again, that could be interpreted differently.
It's true,
yeah. But I think, that the best response to this, in my opinion, is to discuss it, to reconsider the ritual on a regular basis. So that's one thing I'd very much like to experiment with at some stage. I mean, I had an idea for really a retreat about ritual in which all the ritual will be negotiated and related to what those individuals needed at that point.
Well, what if you don't reach consensus?
Then you can't have a ritual. But I guess that people who came on a retreat about ritual would be disposed towards reaching some sort of consensus. But or maybe they can do different things together or something. Who knows?
Try out loads of different religious rituals and see which ones work for it.
Could do, if that helps. Yeah.
It's not like we've not been having rituals this week. Like, for example, the poetry reading. That's just a ritual.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Yeah, as is ringing bell. Yeah. So, see if anyone finds that oppressive, then do bring it up. But
rituals are presumably meant to be like mindfulness exercises, promoting or encouraging integration, aren't they? They're not done blindly. And if you're just doing, so approaching that way, I mean, it's
exactly.
You can do anything as a ritual and get meaning out of it.
Indeed, but often if the original intention behind a ritual is to promote integration in some way, the assumption often seems to be that whenever that's done in future, it will have that effect, which obviously doesn't take into account, really the embodied nature of the people involved in the ritual. Their experience is going to vary hugely of the same ritual formats. And I feel very much also about things like school assemblies and sermons and things of that kind, that they've got often the approach tends to be representational in the sense that the idea is that if you feed in something, you give them a bunch of content, whatever it is, then they'll absorb it, regardless of what that content actually means in the embodied situation of the people concerned.
But if you don't offer it to them, they'll definitely not absorb it.
True. But you can offer it if you take into account more what those people's embodied situation is when you offer it, then there'll be something. There's a possibility of it being more meaningful to them.
And then that suggests, so for instance, the Muslim schools in Birmingham, it'd actually be better to just promote Muslim values, Islam, to them, because that is what means more to them embodied, because 95% of them are Islamic. Right, so...
Right, but that doesn't necessarily follow just because they're from an Islamic background that that's how they'll feel about it, though, does it?
But it would mean that it was probably... there's likelihood that it would be more embodied meaning from that.
Possibly, but that would suggest to me more that people should work with Muslim ritual rather than just embody a tradition, rather than just adopt a Muslim ritual from tradition. If you also want to find out, how do the children actually feel about this Muslim ritual, you shouldn't just assume that because they're Muslims they'll be really happy about it.
Yeah.
Because they may well be aware of the wider society they're in. They have a greater desire to try and fit in.
But either way, we'd have to ask them, wouldn't we?
Exactly.
We wouldn't know that we would.
Yeah.
I think the point that you made that's really salient here is this idea of discussion, which you originally were sort of preempting, that you can make it a lot more malleable and inclusive by checking in with people.
Yeah, so, and obviously that's not just a point about religious groups, it's all kinds of other contexts where you could use it. Okay, and then perhaps just a little bit about other sorts of contexts of groups, actually. So particularly coming back to the question of the integration of groups and the way in which the judgments of groups can be improved. So I think scientific method is a good example of the ways in which groups can, well, particularly traditions, can try and sort of, well, ritualise a greater degree of objectivity. So, obviously, one of the keys to scientific method is looking for falsifications or being open to falsifications, and things like, say in medical research, blind testing and so on, considers the possibility of falsifications rather than just reconfirming something you've assumed in the first place. So, and then there's the way in which new scientists being trained, well, it won't just be through the particular things they do or that they're told to do or the rules they follow, but also the example set by the rigour of their colleagues or their teachers or whatever, which can inspire them in that particular way. So there are obviously rituals involved there, and those rituals will vary obviously in different branches of science, but those rituals could have a positive effect, provided they're pursued in an integrated way. But like other rituals, it would be possible for them to become unhelpful, particularly if there's a conflict involved or some assumptions aren't questioned or something of that kind. So it's possible in that way for groups to become more or less justified through the judgments they make or through the assumptions they make over a period of time. So I think that applies both to more and less formal groups, and I was saying earlier about how I think political integration is, to a greater or lesser extent, is possible depending on the internal integration of the governing powers and their relationship to those they're governing. And of course all that also depends on the integration of all the people involved. So it's incredibly complex when you start thinking about what's involved in political or social integration, because it's a sort of compound of all the different psychological integrations that are going on for all the people involved. And so any generalisations you make about it are going to be pretty broad. But again, I don't think that means that we can't generalise or attempt to do so. Okay. Now, in terms of practice then in relation to groups, obviously one of the ways in which I'm trying to practice in this respect is through the development of the middle way society, so to try and strike that balance. And that's I suppose an open question that I'd like to ask you, whether on your experience so far you think the middle way society strikes that balance. I mean, personally, I think it's important to not to be afraid of leadership in some way. So that's why I'm doing these talks, for example, to try and offer something positive, but at the same time to make that provisional. So that's the balance, which is always difficult to strike, and there's always ways in which one could criticise it. And then, of course, one can ask that question just as well about any other groups, so you could compare the middle way society to any other groups you're involved in. And so as that also relates to another aspect of practice, which is basically, you could call it political practice, in the sense that where there are groups which may use power or authority in certain ways in society, so we need to strike a middle way between ideological rigidity on the one hand, which may take the form of traditions in a group and so on, and ideas that are associated with those traditions, beliefs that are associated with them. But on the other hand, a sort of lack of direction almost, or antinomianism, a sort of a degree of openness which prevents that group addressing conditions in a different way because it doesn't have very clear goals that are shared by people in the group. So,
what's antinomianism?
Antinomianism is the belief that there shouldn't be any rules. So it's usually used in ethical discussion. Yeah. So perhaps I see we can think about that in relation to our attitude to politics. Can we strike that middle way between having ideas and direction, perhaps, and also supporting those that offer one to an appropriate level, but without allowing that to become rigid. But also, how does that fit with your experience of the middle way society so far? Any thoughts?
I think that in terms of politicians or whatever, if they lack direction, then I think that they're seen as weak. So, so I think that whilst they wouldn't be open with the ideological rigidity that they hold, because that might also alienate a lot of people, they are nevertheless reticent to be seen to be lacking direction as well at the same time. So they do try to find a middle ground, I suppose, in between them. I think they probably hold ideological rigidity significantly more than they do any sort of lack of direction, because they're obviously striving for some sort of change or something.
That's interesting, because politicians have, well, in Britain at least, seem to have become less ideological in the last few decades.
We're told that they sort of shrink into there, but I think you'll probably find behind closed doors in like certain cigar parlours or whatever, that they would probably be a lot more open about their true.
The true motivation is to get elected again in 5 years' time, it seems. So
you think it's only the drive for power rather
well,
than
that
the
is
drive
not only, but that seems to predominate a lot of.
So rather than an ideology such as like working towards the
well,
free,
they're using
free market
ideology as a means to an end, I suppose.
Okay.
Even if they originally start off with an ideology, but then maybe that's with pragmatism. But you end up with the tail wagging the dog. It seems really often.
I think for me, when I reflect on my membership with Middle Way Society, most of my life I've been very averse to joining any form of group or calling myself this and that. A bit like what other people have mentioned here, I've been a bit like a bee, buzzed around, and I was in the Labour Party for a short time in my 20s, and I've been in various other groups, but then I've ended up becoming dissatisfied, often because of a rigidity that I've perceived, or maybe my standards were too high, I don't know. But what I like about the Middle Way Society, that it's a method, it's not something that I have to agree with absolutely. It's what I like about it is that it's provisionality. That's what I find really attractive, and that it's a work in progress. So that helps me feel that I can play a part in that too. But it's helped me in the sense that it's a method to be more integrated, and in that sense it's made me more disposed to joining other groups that are helping me with integration. It's like there's a feedback loop going on there. So for example, recently I've joined the Green Party. I'd like to think that I'll be able to engage with that organisation with more of a recognition now of the emotional limitations of the people in the group as well, rather than having too high standards for them. And I've got that perspective more through the Middle Way Society. So it's opened me up to spread out a bit more, and I certainly don't want to just be part of the Middle Way Society. It actually enables me to become more integrated. That's my thoughts.
That certainly reflects how I'd like the society to work, for it to be kind of porous, in that, and that somewhat contrasts with my experience of Tree Ratner as being quite a sort of self-contained, self-referential group, but a group that helps people to engage with the right balance in other groups. And I think that also I've got in mind there the question that Sacha asked. Do you remember were you there when she asked this question in the Westmoreland Hall?
No, I probably left by then.
Right. But she asked at the end of a talk I'd given there about the Middle Way, Where's the inspiration? And that's obviously the kind of question you might get from many religious practitioners encountering this, because they get a lot of inspiration from their religious tradition. So they want to, where's the inspiration that you're going to get from the middle way? And I guess my response to that overall is wherever you experience it. So it may well be, I'm not expecting the middle way society never necessarily to offer all the inspiration that people need. It's not a sort of complete solution to all human requirements. You may need to tap in on a tradition or whatever in various ways in order to find the inspiration you need. But the middle way society doesn't exclude doing that, and the practice of the middle way generally doesn't exclude tapping in on a variety of sources. It's just supporting people with approaching those sources in a particular way, which is provisional. Any other thoughts?
I'm just thinking about this, the issue of sort of leadership and sort of approaches to that. And in this setting, obviously I'm having to defer to you as leader because you've got the knowledge that I don't have about what your approach is. But to some extent, how do I express this? It's like I'm limited in my capacity to evaluate what you're teaching, because unless I've done all the study that you've done, read all the books that you've done and all the books that you've written, I don't know whether I would have come to the same conclusions. So whatever you're offering, I'm having to evaluate it purely from the very limited experiences that I have that relate to it. And so there's kind of a difficulty there, because I can't make a holistic decision, if you like.
Yeah.
So that to some degree there has to be, I suppose, a certain amount of trust in my experience of you and what you've expressed of how you've got there and your background and how you're presenting the material. And so unless I am going to undertake doing all that study, and however long that would take me, to try and see whether I get to the same conclusions, then at some point I just have to say, well, okay, this makes sense or it doesn't for me, insofar as I've got awareness and of experience in my life. And so I'm willing to then, accept your authority and leadership based on, that superior level of expertise.
I personally wouldn't do that. I agree with, I understand where you're coming from, but I think this comes back to this right versus left brain that we've been talking about. So you're looking at it in terms of, I want to be able to analyse it in the left brain way that Robert might have analysed it.
Right.
But actually, it's about your right brain coming through and just sort of seeing whether or not you sort of feel it, or sort of like you don't have to have done all of the left brain analysis that Robert's gone through. You sort of let your right brain just sort of understand it. For instance, you putting yourself down saying that you haven't done it. Einstein wouldn't sit there and do that. I don't think Einstein would just weigh it up himself. And obviously he's got a good brain, but he wouldn't let himself get bogged down in the sort of like the left brain analysis of it. Would just sort of come to his own conclusion based on it. And we can all do that. We've all got that right brain that just allows us to just sort of be a feeling more.
But that's where the trust thing comes in, you see, because is that a feature of the right brain, that to develop trust or something? Because that's where I was thinking, I'm saying I recognise that I'm not going to be able to do all that stuff, on the left brain side. So at some point, I'm going to have to just make a decision based on a wider sense and trust whether that's a right brain feature or not. I'm not sure, but presumably it would be.
Yeah, that's what I took from what you said. Yeah. But like anything else, trust can be interpreted absolutely or provisionally. And so what I've taken from what you're saying is that from my experience, I'm going to trust Robert, but, with a degree of provisionality as well, because he's a human being subject to fallibility, which he fully recognises, and so do you.
Yeah. But I think whenever we make a judgment, there's a gestalt, there's a holistic element to it. We're not going to be able to see all the things we're judging at the same time and be absolute in our recognition of them. Rather, we more like to have an overview. Again, given our embodied way of understanding things, in effect, I think we make decisions with our bodies. And so that doesn't mean that it can't incorporate a lot of left brain activity. But obviously, whenever we make a judgment, we need to try and take into account as much of that information as we can. But there's always things like, time limiting and capacity limiting and so on in any judgment we make at any point. Whether it's, should I jump in and save that drowning child, or am I more likely to be drowned myself? And you've got to make a quick decision about whether that's the case, and one based on the limitations of those circumstances, as well as just the ideal of what should be what the outcome should be.
And you may argue differently, but I would argue that you probably haven't read everything that you could have around these subjects either.
That's correct.
You might have done more than anyone else, but you still won't have read everything that's out there that could possibly relate, because that would be just impossible.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just to pick up on one thing, what you're saying about the left brain stuff, though, my interpretation of a lot of this stuff is that it's a very synthetic thing, a combination of both the left and the right brain. Robert is presenting this in a very systematic way, which is left brain. But I mean, we're just talking about practice now, which is very much engaging with experience, which is there's a lot more of the right brain.
And I also recognise that, I can't just evaluate things based on my sort of left brain thinking, that part of this will be going away and processing it more and practicing, engaging with it in a practice sense. So, maybe if I came back again next year, I would be in a different position and perhaps want to challenge certain things more, or might be more sure of certain things and feel that I'm deferring perhaps a bit less to Robert's authority in that regard, because I've had more experience, so I might not have got more theoretical knowledge, or I might have gained a bit more as well in that time. Yeah. But I will be feeling slightly more empowered because I've kind of embodied, whatever I've learnt a little bit more within myself. Yeah,
and I think what I like about it is that you have that space and trust within this society or philosophy to be able to do that, and that you are encouraged to do that because it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that there might be a difficulty in building a real group consensus at any one point, because people will always be at different provisionals and different incrementals along those lines. So in terms of people getting to that sort of end game that you might get with "I believe in Christ" or whatever else, you never go into I believe 100% in the middle way society. You're never going to get that. So that might just be more difficult in terms of forming a stark, strong sort of standard group in that way. No, well, I don't know, but that's the question that you asked, wasn't it? Around like the how the group is forming around the middle way. Yeah, and so. Yeah, maybe you don't want that, but then you've got to recognise that you don't want that, and recognise that it's going to be.
I think there is a recognition that there are no end goals. What I find really nice about it is, like, an example of that is on the site. So there's a lot of people are engaging with all this stuff with varying degrees of interest and knowledge and engagement. But there is, to me, that there is a very rich synthesis going on there. And I think what I like especially is that it more than the content itself is the way people are engaging in a non-dogmatic, by and large, non-dogmatic, provisional way, which sort of sets the tone.
Any thoughts on any of this, Martin?
As I said, there's no end goals, are there? It's a practice, isn't it? It's a practice you're offering rather than a lens, as you said. So I can't see why an organisation can't be. It's like Tai Chi, there's no end to that. It's just practice, isn't it? So it can't stand alone as a practice. I would think that people could hear around that. How much that practice has actually changed people's dogmatic attitudes and anything I'd be interested to know. I mean, has anyone arrived at any, should I say, has this changed anyone's attitudes or beliefs about anything political or social or anything, having held this lens up to it?
It would definitely change the lexicon with which I use to describe some of this stuff. Like when I'm going and having those arguments with friends and whatever, I would change the language that I use. Whether or not it's changed any fundamental beliefs, though, I'm not 100% sure. Because you're probably open to these ideas when you come through the door. If you had those fundamental beliefs, you wouldn't necessarily be walking through that door.
Mm. I think for me, like you said something, we were talking about veganism the other day, and I asked you what your position on it was, and you said, well, I haven't really thought about it. And I think one thing that being a member of the society is I'm thinking about things more, that every action that you take in life is a moral decision. You know, when you go shopping, everything you buy is a moral decision. And so it's increased my awareness in that way. If I reflect back a year or two to where I am now, I recognise that integration is asymmetrical, but I feel that in some ways I'm making better decisions in quite a few situations. I've got a bit obsessed by it, and I have to recognise. I also have to recognise that I run a business, and I have to keep things. I have to pull my weight equally with my partner too, and that's the middle way at times has clashed with that. And so there's an example of asymmetry going on there. So I need to find the balance. I constantly need to find that balance too. But yeah, I feel that it helps me make better decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering whether Martin's saying that it's a practice, which in a broad sense it is, but it's a practice in the same way that all kinds of thinking and judgment are practices, and it sort of includes a wide range of, you know, it's an approach to a wide range of judgments in different contexts. So that makes it very difficult to assess in that kind of way, obviously. And there's also the time framing issue. You know, how long do you give it? And you know, and I think all those the parameters for those kind of judgments, you know, does the middle way work? Can only be decided by individuals. It's no, you know, you can't say you've got to give it 5 years or something, you know, to judge it correctly. Although, I suppose personally, I think you probably need to be thinking in those sorts of, in terms of those sorts of lengths of time, to be thinking about, you know, the complexity of taking it on board, working out the implications and applying them, and then seeing how well the applications work. You know, that's a long-term job, however long you think of it as being. But obviously, if we are to think of the middle way as being provisional, or middle way philosophy as being provisional, there does need to be a time framing of some sort, you know, because if we just open-ended, you know, if you need to be committed to it indefinitely to see whether it works, then in effect it's not falsifiable in any sense whatsoever. So I suggest that people think through that framing for themselves, as it were, that time framing. It's no way, it's not going to come anywhere near these sort of clear boundaries that scientists have to give to the time framing of an experiment which is intended to prove a theory of some kind, of a more narrowly focused theory of some kind, but it nevertheless could have some kind of time framing, or possibly needs it. And all that maybe also depends on how much your life reflects the middle way already, because in many ways, you know, other people describe it as common sense, which is great. I think in many ways it is common sense. If common sense just means the sort of wisdom people arrive at through experience, because that's just what the middle way is all about. It's about, you know, what we arrive at through experience.
There's that level of scepticism.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. So it's examination of our assumptions is perhaps the element that people in general are less familiar with.
I have slight trouble when you keep using the middle way, you know, as if there's the middle way as an absolute, that we arrive at a position which is the middle way, therefore it's the, correct way. Because many people do put forward, opinions or beliefs which to them may seem to be the middle way, but if you're somewhere else on the spectrum, it doesn't seem like the middle way.
Well, I do stick to the use of the, and I also use capitals, because in any one given situation, there is only one point of balance in the judgment of the person who's applying the middle way. It's not as though there were lots of middle ways in that circumstance. It's not that you could choose either this or this and it will be just as good. If the middle way is the best option in an embodied circumstance, that's always got to be remembered, rather than a completely abstracted one. Then it's the best option, then it's got to be unique.
But provisional, yeah.
But provisional.
And again, as this use of language, I found, I'd be interested for a handout of expressions, I could use to make sure I'm maintaining mindfulness of provisionality when I'm making any assertion.
Of expressions you could use?
Yes.
Right. Okay. I'll bear that in mind.
Well, it's just an aid to practice, I would have thought.
Yeah.
NVC is good for that.
Well, it struck me that, what I'm sort of provisionally thinking that I'm gaining from my learning in all of this is that it's another tool that will support my approach to trying to be in the world in a way that sort of meets my values. And I discovered NVC, and that's been a big part of helping me to actually articulate that better and to find ways to sort of get on better with others, try to understand their perspectives at a deeper level and facilitate, negotiating harmony, hopefully, where there's potential conflict. And I sort of think what you've been explaining about the middle way has just given me maybe a broader awareness about some things to be mindful of and bring into that, when considering issues with other people and making decisions about different things. But obviously, going away and incorporating some of that into practice, I'll see how that goes over time.
Just going back to Martin's point, is then the middle way always the most sort of balanced / integrative way?
Yeah,
That's
in any one circumstance, yeah.
In any one circumstance. So there might be a number of relatively balanced options, but we're saying that the most balanced, most integrative option is the middle way.
Yeah. So our actual judgments are obviously only ever going to approximate to it. So what we think the middle way is, may be multiple. We may have varied judgments about it as different individuals.
Yeah. So you and I may have like the same power, whatever. But we may be based on what we embody. We might come up with different versions of what the middle way.
Yeah.
Therefore is.
Yeah.
So there will never be an absolute because it will always be based on.
Yeah, and that's going to be, I think, more and more evident that the more specific the issues. So that there are going to be, particularly take something like politics or electoral systems or David Cameron or something like this. There are liable to be a variety of interpretations of what the middle way means when applied to one's judgments about such complex issues. Because obviously they involve a great multiplicity of potential conditions that you could take into account, different ones you might choose to highlight and make the basis of your judgment. So the middle way is just steering you in the direction, I think, of addressing a wide range of conditions. But obviously which ones you then choose to address is going to depend on your circumstances and your inclinations and so on.
So the absolute middle way will only ever be a subjective viewpoint. It can only ever be your own subjective.
I just don't use the word subjective, I'm afraid. But
embodied.
Yeah, embodied would be better. Yeah, yeah. Okay. There's all sorts of assumptions about subjective and what it is, Yeah, but it's going to be, or you could say your individual viewpoint, yeah, or even your time-bound, momentary individual judgment.
Yeah.
And it's not just the judgment; it's the way you hold the judgment
That makes it middle way.
that makes
Yes.
it middle way.
Yeah.
Because you can't judge, the coal badgers, not the coal badgers, not the coal, and then think, not the coal badgers, I'll die for that. You have to say, well, I provisionally think that at this stage it's knowledge, whatever, not to come is the way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with a belief, you have to keep making judgments about it. Yeah, you can't just stop there.
Yeah.
Does that belief continue to be appropriate as you go on?
So you're unlikely to die for your beliefs as a middle way practitioner. Is that good as a rough line?
Likely, perhaps not impossible, but
Somebody else might kill you.
indeed.
If you won't convert to their dogmatic way of thinking.
There's plenty of scope for middle way positions being assumed by one metaphysical extreme to be the other extreme, and therefore they'll be just as violent in their reaction to as they would to an extreme.
Because essentially, you might just say no, and that would be the opposite to yes.
Yes, quite.
So yeah, it would be the opposite.
Yeah, but particularly if you think about false dichotomous thinking, so like George Bush famously said about terrorism, you're either with the terrorists or you're with us, or you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. So obviously, if you don't agree with George Bush, then you must be a terrorist or terrorist sympathiser, and therefore subject to extermination by drones. Quad out demonstration.
Serves you right.
Yeah.
Oh dear.